I would actually like to introduce our first speaker. She is Dr. Amy Paul Ward. She is a cross-trained social scientist with over 20 years of experience in higher education. Wonderful soul, beautiful spirit. Had the opportunity to speak with her on all of the different topics related to education, and I was absolutely excited to hear someone want to combine the medical sciences with education to see how it can bring beautiful changes to what we have as inclusive education in Trinidad and Tobago. She's an associate professor in the Department of Occupational Therapy at Florida International University, and Dr. Paul Ward is currently here in Trinidad and Tobago as a Fulbright Research and Teaching Fellow. So she chose Trinidad and Tobago as her domain for research. Her program of research focuses on access and inclusion for persons with disabilities across all settings. So I am actually very excited and quite honored to have the opportunity to introduce her to the podium and the platform. And I welcome you all to be engaged. And as Glenn rightly informed you all, if you all have any questions, by all means, you all can wait when the floor is open. And those of you all joining us on Zoom, you can submit to there as well. Thank you. So Dr. Amy Ward.
So I have to hold it closer. Okay, so this is the title of my talk this morning, Finding Intersections and Creating Bridges for Achieving Inclusion in Schools. And so these are a couple of the things that I wanted to accomplish in our time together this morning. I wanted to tell you a little bit about my own background and why I do the things that I do and why I'm actually here in Trinidad. I wanted to talk about current gaps, although I think that conversation is less necessary because you're already here and so many of us know what the gaps are. But I wanted to also talk about what the common goals that we have and how we can find intersections in those goals and create collaborations for achieving inclusion moving forward. So, as Angelica said, I have over 20 years of experience in higher education, which makes me very old. But I originally grew up in Los Angeles. I'm from California. I originally thought I was going to go to medical school. I wanted to be a doctor. But I was always worried about the sciences. And I was worried about how difficult it would be to get into medical school. So I always engaged in academic activities that would set me apart from all the other students that wanted to go to medical school. So that led me to anthropology, which is a field which looks at the relationship between culture and other aspects of life. And so for me, wanting to go to medical school, I was always interested in health and well-being and how culture and the environment impacts our understanding of health and well-being and how we seek to achieve that health and well-being. Well, in order to do that, I had the opportunity to do an advanced academic program in anthropology that led me to do research. And my very first research project was as an undergraduate. I went to the Philippines and I conducted a study. And I was working with women who were working as prostitutes to send money back home to their families. So the youngest woman that I spoke with while I was there was 13 years old. And as somebody who wanted to go to medical school, I was so struck by the sacrifices that women would make in order to send money home to support their families that I thought, wait a minute, I don't want to go to medical school anymore. I want to do research to understand why some communities are marginalized and don't have access to opportunities that allow them to achieve full inclusion, health, and well-being. And so I decided to go back, finish my degree, and go on and get a doctoral degree in medical anthropology. And so On paper, it seems like, well, how did she get to disability? How is she here in Trinidad now doing this work? And so my journey is one that eventually I did my dissertation research in Barbados. I moved to the Caribbean. I lived in Barbados, where I met my husband. And so now we're back in the US, we're living our lives. We decide that we want to have our first child. I have a very normal pregnancy, walk into the hospital, everything is fine. Something went wrong in the delivery. And while we think it's epidural related, nobody has ever confirmed for me what the cause of my now disability is. I left the hospital using a walker, and I have permanent disability in my right leg, which makes certain mobility difficult for me. But in the scheme, along a continuum of impairment, to the outside world, I look normal. But from that time, I became very interested in navigating the disability landscape. I had a degree, I had access to information, I had a job, and yet I couldn't navigate the healthcare system as a newly disabled person, using a walker, being the support of my family, and what that looked like. And I began to be marginalized at work. People started to question my ability to do my job, which was a thinking job. I was a health communication specialist working for a government agency in the United States. And I didn't know that laws existed that would allow me to ask for reasonable accommodations in my work environment. I couldn't drive, and so they would not give me the accommodations that I needed, which led me to suffer from depression, to try and figure out what life would look for me now that people looked at me with questions. One of my bosses asked for a doctor's note for me to be able to travel. And I thought, why do I need a doctor's note? And they thought that the stress of travel might be too difficult for me to perform my job duties once I got there, because my legs weren't working right. And when I questioned them, my boss's justification was, well, if you got up from your desk, you couldn't run down the hall. Well, I was a health education specialist, where in my job description was hall running. Like, it didn't make sense, so make it make sense for me. So eventually I left that job and went to do a postdoctoral fellowship in disability. And as part of that fellowship, my supervisor said, why don't you do a degree in occupational therapy? You don't want to be a therapist, so we're going to make a special program just for you where you learn about the research and theory aspects of occupational therapy. And most of us in this room know somebody who has had occupational therapy or needed occupational therapy, yes? Or has heard about the profession and what it does for people with disabilities. Up until that point, I had never heard of occupational therapy because I had never needed it. And so in the same way that here in Trinidad, a lot of people don't know about occupational therapy, are never referred to occupational therapy, don't know what the benefits of occupational therapy are, I was in that same situation. And so I moved states, I packed up my family and off we went for me to do a fellowship in disability studies. And it was like doing occupational therapy on myself as I started to understand all of the different forms of discrimination that I was experiencing as a person with an invisible disability. I was using a walker, and I was constantly amazed by the looks that people would give me, looking at my legs, trying to figure out, like, you look normal, what is going on here? Like, why are you using this? Like, somehow I was pretending. And so that led me to want to understand disability stigma and to examine ways for people with disability to navigate systems that prevented them from achieving full inclusion. And so I've been doing that work for 20 years now with lots of different populations. And as everybody said, as you were both speaking, I kept thinking, they're making my points. Like, they're saying what I wanted to say. So, like, what are they leaving for me to say here? But I've worked with populations who have visible and invisible disabilities, who find themselves in bureaucratic systems that prevent them from fully participating in the meaningful activities that they want to do, which is a foundational principle in occupational therapy, which is to help people to adapt their environments to support them in the activities that they find meaningful. And so that is very relevant for our conversations today around how we achieve inclusion for persons with disabilities in schools in Trinidad. And I think that we have to think about all of the different intersections that exist in Trinidad that both support and prevent inclusion. And I think one of the places that we have to start is around stigma and cultural beliefs and values as it relates to how people experience disability here and in Trinidad, recognizing that even the two islands have different cultural beliefs and values, even though you are considered one country. Because when you're in Trinidad and you talk about Tobago, people say, oh, no, that's Tobago. They think they do things differently there. They think differently there. And then you come to Tobago and you hear the same thing. So even though as an outsider looking in, I think, oh, I'm going to Trinidad and Tobago, it's two parts of the same whole. We have to look at each context and see where the similarities lie and where those differences lie, and how we can find those intersections, and from those intersections, build bridges. And so I like to think in metaphors, so I think about intersections and bridges, because we can't do this work alone. And so I've heard Glenn do these talks before, and he talks about the responsibilities starting in the home. But that puts a lot of pressure on families who are often dealing with multiple challenges at the same time. So dealing with the disability of a child or a family member, and the stigma that people experience both directly and kind of behind our backs, right? You know, people always want to talk about, what did you do when you were pregnant? Like, why is your child like that? It must be your fault. What did you do? Or who did your family anger that they sent that to you? Or why is God punishing you? Or even when people say God only gives you what you can handle. So you're supposed to view these things as a blessing because God is blessing you, because God knows that, you know, He can send this to you because you can overcome it, you can handle it. So we have all these cultural beliefs and values that we're dealing with. And then we have the physical landscape of both Trinidad and Tobago. So if you're a person with a physical disability, the physical spaces already tell you very obviously and very subtly that maybe we don't want you here because it's challenging to navigate them. And if you were to butt up on me in Port of Spain, walking, because I cannot drive here, I'd be dead in 2 seconds with the way Trinidadians drive. Know your limitations. I know my limitations. I'm not driving here. But you will see me, and obviously I stick out already. Who is this white girl with purple hair? What is she doing here? But you will see me standing on street corners evaluating the curb height. So already I have to see how I can get off the curb, get across the street without getting licked down in the road and get up on the other side. So I have to find the right curb height. If I can find a curb cut with a ramp where somebody with a wheelchair could navigate. So your physical spaces are already difficult. Your school settings, without ramps, without elevators, with stairs. And the stories that I've been told from individuals who've gone through the school system who use mobility devices like wheelchairs. And one particular story stands out to me, where she was being enrolled in the secondary school and the principal was willing to take her, which is a conversation we'll have next around principals being able to tell you that they won't take your child in the school because your child has a disability. They said, yes, we will take your child, but her classroom is upstairs. And there's no way for her wheelchair to get upstairs. Well, what common sense is that? Move the classroom downstairs. Why does the class have to be upstairs? Bring the teacher downstairs. So minor structural systems that have existed, that it's a decision. Move the classroom downstairs. So not only that, she couldn't even get in the front door of the building to get to the upstairs. Her father had to, on the weekend, take his own supplies to the school to build a ramp for her to access the school. So physical spaces. But then the issue of the power of the teacher, which is obviously different teachers than a teacher like Angelica, who has trained to specifically work with children with special needs. But the idea that a teacher who's paid by the government could tell you, no, I'm sorry, I won't teach your child. So as much as Glenn doesn't like to talk about challenges, these are realities. And in order to address and make changes, we have to acknowledge what the situation looks like. And we know that there are opportunities here as we come together to form partnerships. And it's funny because Angelica and Renuka, and I'm pronouncing your name wrong, Renuka. I'm still doing Renako. I'm still doing it. Sorry, I'm terrible. If you ask my students in Miami, I tell them all the time that when I'm angry at my kids, I call them by the dog's name. So, because there's just too many. You just get flustered and you just pick whatever name comes to your head. So that is what I do. But we need to partner. We need the teachers to come together. We need occupational therapists to come together. We have a new, relatively new, occupational therapy program at the University of the Southern Caribbean, which has significantly added to the number of occupational therapists who are practicing both in Trinidad and Tobago. And occupational therapists are trained to work with children. And if we look to models of practice in other parts of the world, because obviously, why reinvent the wheel? We need to take bits and pieces from other places that make sense for the local context. Because obviously, you can't take what we have in America and bring it to Trinidad and just dump it here and say this is going to work. Because we have to take into account what the existing system looks like, what the existing resources are, and how we adapt other programs to make sense in a local context. But we have occupational therapists here. And so if you look at school-based practice in the US, the goal of a school-based occupational therapist is to provide support in the classroom for the child with a disability to be successful. It's to help the student break down academic activities into manageable, meaningful blocks so that if something is perceived as too difficult, we grade it backwards. Okay, let's make it to a smaller activity. Let's work together to master that skill and then start to grade the activity forward. So we meet the child where they are, let them master the skill, and move forward. So for some children, it might be activity planning. For some of them, it might be, how do I keep my desk organized? How do I maintain my own physical space? How do I attend to what the teacher is talking about? Maybe I need an aide to help me as I'm breaking down these activities. But we need to look for other models that make sense here. Speech language pathologists, speech therapists, in school settings, or at least providing access for families from the moment their child is identified as having a disability. Because we know from research evidence that the earlier you start providing support services, the better the child is going to be over the long term, because you help them start to prepare before they ever enter school. But if you wait for the child to get to school, you're already behind, because these children are going to need extra supports. So if you have prepared them early and started to address some of those foundational learning skills that a child is going to need in the classroom, they're going to perform at a higher level. And one of the problems that we see is that regardless of the disability, the minute you put a label on a child, we already pre-assume what that child can do. Well, how many of us know people in our communities that were perceived to be overachievers? They had every resource, they had every opportunity, and they do nothing. But on paper, they look like they should be very successful. So we know that somebody's appearance and what we perceive to be their strengths may not be so. And so just on the virtue of giving somebody a label, we cannot presume that they are incapable of doing everyday tasks or being successful in school. And that's one of the issues that I think that from my experiences here in Trinidad, I should back up for a second. I was here last spring for 3.5 months, and I am back here again for 4 months. But one of the things that I have learned is that a lot of these same issues are not solely a Trinidadian problem. You can go to almost any Caribbean island and you're going to see similar challenges for families of children with disabilities. And so it's in addition to thinking about, more training of teachers, greater inclusion of rehabilitation specialists in school settings, in early intervention settings. We also have to, I'm going to go to what Glenn always talks about, which is legislation. Legislation doesn't solve our problems, but it holds people accountable. Because if you only have draft policies, people say, well, I'm just doing what the school policy says. And if there's no legislation that says every child in Trinidad deserves access to a free public education in the least restrictive environment with the supports they need to be successful, you don't achieve that. Because we see that we don't get what we don't ask for, but very often we have to fight for this. And if you look at the disability rights movement in the United States, you see that it took years and it resulted in people fighting figuratively. Initially the disability rights movement in the US started with white middle-class men who wanted to go to college, and the physical buildings, the actual campuses were not accessible. So we have hundreds of images of white men throwing themselves out of their wheelchairs and crawling up the steps on the campuses, demanding inclusive spaces. And then we saw that start to spread, where people demanded access to these spaces. And so there's a political will that needs to be cultivated, and champions that need to be identified, and collaborations that need to be made across disability organizations. Because if you look, there's 6 autism-oriented associations. How many Down syndrome associations are there? 1? Glenn says 1. Only. So what about National Down Syndrome Association? Do they exist? No. No, done. Okay, so see, when you're an outsider, you come in, you step in everybody's mess because you don't know, or you step on yourself. But Autism Society, Down Syndrome Family Network, what about the groups that support children with cerebral palsy? The Blind Welfare Association, the people for, there's 5 blind association, blind and hard of, and visually impaired. Everybody fighting their own battles, but the battles are the same. The issues are the same. It's inclusion. It's being accepted in everyday life, being part of the community, not being marginalized. If children aren't given the opportunity to go to school and to excel in areas that are meaningful to them, we know that not everybody wants to go to college. And some people want to work with their hands. And some people like to work with people. Everybody has the right to explore the skills and talents that they want to develop, and to have opportunities to contribute to their communities in meaningful ways through these skills and talents. But if children are not given the opportunity to go to school, to play sports, to have leisure activities, to be out and about in the world, then they don't get those opportunities. And we need to work together to achieve them. So it was funny because we were having these conversations and I would make a comment and then these two would laugh at me. And then they're like, no, we're not laughing at you. But then the but would come. But this is what it looks like here. And then they would say, well, what about this? And they'd say, mm-hmm. And they'd giggle at me and they'd say, no, sorry, we're really not making fun of you. But we need to get to the point where we're not always saying, but. We need to identify where our opportunities are and look to other places to see what resources have been leveraged. So, for example, at my university, we have a program for young adults with neurodiversities. So, young adults with autism, learning disabilities, hydrocephaly, Down syndrome. They can come and do a program at our university for individuals in those categories. And they come and they take classes on our campus, and they can live on campus if they choose, and they take life skill classes. And guess what? They're not the only ones that need life skills. All of the students on my campus need life skills. They show up and they don't know how to manage their money, and they don't know how to keep their dorm rooms clean, and they don't know how to cook, and they don't know how to function in the world, and they don't have any labels. So label, no label, every college student needs life skills. But they come, they get life skills classes, They attend classes with other students, but they don't get grades. They audit the classes. And so it's considered academic enrichment and social inclusion. They are part of the broader fabric of the community, and they get to participate in ways that they choose. Is it perfect? No. Thank you. So, they have this opportunity to participate in this program, and they get a peer mentor, and they get a faculty mentor, and they are members of our community. It's not always perfect, but students have an opportunity to come and experience college life. And guess what? The university is better for it, because universities and communities are better when everyone is included, because everybody brings something valuable to the community. So we need to re-envision what an inclusive community looks like. And people deserve, regardless of disability, to achieve personal agency and make decisions for themselves. And so we have to think about what inclusion can and should look like based on what people want. And so I can't come and say, I'm going to include you, and this is how I'm going to include you. I need to know how you want to be included, how you want to participate. And that's where we need to remove barriers. And we can't make assumptions that my inclusion wishes are the same as yours, because they may not be, for a number of reasons that are completely unrelated to a disability. It's my comfort level, how much I view myself as a social person or not. Maybe I'm more happy doing solitary things, but I need the physical spaces to allow me to do the things that I want to do in the ways that I want to do them. Just like individuals with other types of disabilities should be embraced and welcomed into all spaces. And families should not feel any level of shame or stigma by including their children or relatives with disabilities. Because I know what that feels like when people question, why are you here? Why are you trying to do these things? Or just how you're looked at as different. I always feel a lot of pressure, especially here, walking up and down stairs, because I'm very slow, and because of the instability in my leg, I always go up one foot and then I bring the foot to the same step, and vice versa. And people look at me and they think, oh, she looks relatively young, she looks fit. Why is she in my way? Why is she blocking me? Why is she so slow? And then if it's crowded, the stress of trying to move through this space differently based on my needs, and that stigma that's sort of sent my way, the judgment that you feel, and how do we address these things? And if we constantly say, no, we can't do that, that's not possible here. Every 5 years you get a new government, so they just throw away what the last government did. How do we ever achieve change? So for me, it's how do we keep engaging in these conversations? How do we find local solutions to make impactful change, even if it's starting in one school? Let's have one school, special needs educators, where all children are engaged in ways that address their learning needs, because we all have unique needs, whether we have a disability or not. So let's stop labeling people, and let's start meeting people where they are and providing the supports that they need. And if that means that you need somebody to help you comprehend what you're reading, then that person is there for you. Because just because I walk differently doesn't mean that I can't be engaged. And just because someone might not be able to use their hands doesn't mean that they can't use their brains. They can't verbalize. They can't use their feet. And just because someone might not have legs doesn't mean that they can't be mobile. And we need to stop making excuses for what a reasonable accommodation could be, because that's what you see here when it comes to employment, where employers say, no, it's too expensive, I can't do that. Or I'm only going to hire the person who's the most qualified. But if you never give somebody a chance, you don't know if they're qualified or not. So let's stop saying, no, we can't do this, and let's start saying, yes, we can. And again, that's where it's empowering people, building coalitions, finding champions, being in public spaces from early on, because if people have children with disabilities and they keep them at home, then the same stigma continues. And so it's awareness campaigns. It's, we don't want to be treated any differently. We want to be treated like everybody else, because guess what? We're just like everybody else. And so when people say, oh, regular people, well, what's a regular person? People with disabilities are regular people. So let's stop putting labels on people. You talked about boxes. I don't want to be in a box. Who wants to be in a box? Who wants to be prejudged? So we have to find ways to address that and stop letting people define who we are and what we do. Because people look at me and they're like, why does she have purple hair? Like, what's with that? But we should be allowed to be who we are in the world and to find our own pathways, to find the things that make us happy, and to feel like we are able to contribute to everyday life. Not everybody's qualified to be a brain surgeon. Not everybody has the ability to do that. Not everybody has the ability to be a hairdresser, to be a barber. Like, people have gifts and talents, and we need to give people opportunities to find what their gifts and talents are and to use them in meaningful ways, in ways that they're valued. So I know Glenn wanted me to talk about solutions, but we have to find these foundations first and work together to find what the solutions are that make the most sense for here. Because I can't bring the ADA and just plop it down here in Trinidad. I wish I could. I wish I could wave a magic wand and you all would have legislation that would protect people and give them rights. But we have to find meaningful ways to force government to do that and not give the excuse that, oh, it's going to take 6 years. Because that's what an independent senator told me last year. Oh, we're working on legislation, it'll take about 6 years. Make it make sense, please. So, see, these two just keep laughing at me, so I just don't know what to do with that. So I'm going to leave it here, and if people have questions or they want to talk about things, because I could talk to you for 12 hours. Like, I could just go and go and go. But does that make sense to people? Okay, because sometimes I'm not sure. Well, when you get questioned and people think you're crazy because you're advocating for inclusion and you think everybody should be equal, and that we're all on a continuum. And Glenn is right. I walked into a hospital perfectly healthy, and I walked out not. And it's been 23 years. My son is going to be 23, and my mother still thinks I'm broken. I have a job, support my family, I do what I want, I go where I want, I adapt my own environment to make it work for me. So what's broken? Well, they put me in a box. They put me in a box, they want to keep me in the box, and I'm like, no, sorry, you're not going to keep me in that box. Maybe that's why I wear my hair purple, because I'm like, okay, you're gonna put a stigma label on me. I'm gonna like go full force. I'll give you a reason to stigmatize me. I'll pierce something. I'll tattoo something. I'll wear my hair kind of crazy. Stigmatize me. I'll give you a reason. Well, but if you think, you're laughing, but if you think about it, like if everybody with a disability came together in Trinidad and said, I dare you to keep me out. I dare you to hold me down. I dare you to not let me have a job. Maybe it would be different, because you don't let people tell you what you can and can't do. And how many people say, okay, you want to keep me down? I'm going to start a business. You don't want to hire me? I'm going to start something. I'm going to do it for myself. I don't need you. And maybe that's the mindset. Nothing is going to stop me, not the government, not the teachers. I'm going to do what I need to do to make a life for me that's meaningful, that's engaged, and I'm going to put myself in the community. And if it makes you uncomfortable, that's your business, because there's nothing to make you uncomfortable about me, because I move through the world differently. I am just as equal to you. My life is just as meaningful as yours, and I'm not going to let you forget it. And I think that here, too many times, the stigma keeps people from doing that. It's because their families look at them some kind of way, and so people feel that they feel some kind of way. And so we have to stop doing that. Sorry, I'm not a very formal person.
Thank you very, very much. No, as you would see, she's very interactive.
Yeah.
So we open the floor to her.
Absolutely. Because part of it is self-esteem. So I mentor students with disabilities, and so often it's self-esteem from not being included or being labeled. So one of the young women that I work with, she has hydrocephalus. So if you look at her, you wouldn't necessarily identify her as being a person with a disability. And sometimes that's challenging, the differences between invisible and visible disabilities. So it's kind of like in the US in the old days, we don't talk about this, passing, racially. If you were light-skinned, you passed and you had more opportunities. Well, here now, in disability, you see the same thing. If your disability is invisible, you can kind of navigate the landscape a little bit easier. And so here's a young woman who went through our special education system. She came to the university to do our program, and she always was told that she had a learning disability due to her hydrocephalus. And as a participant in this program, they told her that she had an intellectual disability. And labels really, they matter. How you speak to someone about their own disability or ability matters, because it influences your self-esteem. So in her mind, somebody telling her that she had an intellectual disability, it leveled her, because she always knew she learned differently. She knows that she has hydrocephalus. She knows that she needs certain supports to be successful in the classroom. But when somebody told her, no, you have to tell people you have an intellectual disability, that hit her, because that implied that she can't learn. Because when we talk about intellectual, we're implying how smart you are or not smart. And she's very bright. She just learns differently and has special needs that she supports. She has special supports that she needs to help her be successful. So she has struggled with self-esteem issues for a long time. And when you perpetually, continually tell a child that they're different and you isolate them because of that difference, of course it's going to affect your self-esteem. And so opportunities to participate in sports, in whatever that looks like, whether that's wheelchair sports, whether that's, club sports. And again, like there's different levels of sport. So maybe it's more of a social sport. Not everything has to be competitive, but children should be playing. And if children are being isolated at home because of their disability and not included, that's bad not only for the child, but it's also bad for the community, because we know that you're not born with a view to discriminate against others. You learn to discriminate as you grow up. This is what you see and hear with the people that raise you and the people that you interact with. And so if you never see a person with a disability and all you ever hear is that people with disabilities are whatever negative label that you want to hear. And since I've been here, I've seen and heard some really terrible labels that are used to describe people with disabilities. We should not restrict children from questioning. If I see somebody that doesn't have an arm or a leg or is in a wheelchair and I'm a child, you see somebody and you go, "Oh, mommy, what's wrong with that person? Why is that person like that?" And mommy says, "Oh no, don't look. We don't talk about that. We'll talk about that at home. Don't ask any questions. Don't stare." Then a child learns that that's bad. We don't look at that. We don't talk about that. But if you understand that everybody is different and that everybody has a role to play and a value and a humanity, and you learn that from little, then you carry that with you. And that's where we have to start breaking down some of that stigma, because we don't grow up. I mean, we're not born with that hate or that, unkindness. So yeah.